Marcus had always been fascinated by bees since finding a honeycomb in his grandparents' barn as a child. When he finally purchased his modest home in Oakwood Estates after years of apartment living, the spacious backyard offered the perfect opportunity to pursue his beekeeping dream. His neighbors watched with curiosity as he installed his first hive, complete with a colony purchased from a retiring beekeeper. Marcus's enthusiasm was infectious as he explained the intricate social structure of bees to anyone who would listen. Over 2 years, his single hive grew to 3 thriving colonies that produced honey with distinct flavors depending on the season. Spring honey had notes of clover and apple blossom, while summer honey carried hints of wildflowers and lavender from his carefully planted garden. His signature glass jars with hand-drawn labels became coveted gifts, and several local cafes had begun featuring Oakwood Gold honey on their menus. The side income was nice, but what Marcus truly treasured were the peaceful mornings spent watching his bees work while he sipped coffee, finding meditation in their constant, purposeful buzzing. What few neighbors knew was that beekeeping had been Marcus's lifeline after losing his wife to cancer 3 years earlier. The structured routine of hive maintenance and the bees' remarkable resilience had pulled him through his darkest days. He'd become something of a neighborhood fixture, the quiet engineer who transformed into an animated storyteller whenever someone asked about his bees. Children would stop by after school to watch him work from a safe distance, marveling as he calmly handled frames swarming with bees while explaining how the queen laid up to 2,000 eggs daily. Mrs. Abernethy, the retired elementary school teacher next door, had become particularly invested, often bringing her grandchildren over for what she called nature's most fascinating show. Marcus had meticulously followed every regulation. He'd registered with the state agricultural department, positioned his hives the requisite distance from property lines, installed a decorative fence that doubled as a flight path director, forcing the bees to fly upward before out, keeping them above head height, and even planted specific flowers to keep his bees well-fed without them meaning to venture far. He'd given presentations at the community center about the importance of pollinators and had successfully converted several neighbors from bee-fearers to bee admirers. By the time his operation had grown to 3 hives, Marcus had developed a small but devoted following. Local chefs praised his honey's distinctive terroir, and a prestigious farmers market had accepted him as a vendor. The supplemental income wasn't life-changing, but it funded his beekeeping equipment upgrades and the occasional weekend getaway. More importantly, it validated what his late wife had always told him: find what brings you joy and figure out how to share it with others. Life in Oakwood Estates had settled into a pleasant rhythm that suited Marcus perfectly, until the moving truck arrived next door and the balance of the neighborhood began to shift in ways no one could have anticipated. Patricia Wellington moved into the neighborhood's largest home following her divorce settlement. Within a month, she'd secured a position on the HOA board through a special election marked by suspiciously low turnout. Her first board meeting set the tone, a 4-hour marathon where she presented a binder of community improvement initiatives that mainly involved restrictions and fines. Neighbors began calling her Karen after witnessing her reduce a teenage lawn-mowing entrepreneur to tears over his non-regulation grass collection methods. Patricia's house inspections quickly became notorious. She documented violations with a DSLR camera, with telephoto lens, and delivered violation notices with almost gleeful efficiency. She particularly enjoyed enforcing the rule about trash cans being out of sight by 8 p.m., often waiting in her car to catch violators at 8:01. When she finally discovered Marcus's beehives during one of her property compliance surveys, her eyes lit up with a special gleam reserved for her most satisfying violations. That afternoon, Marcus returned home to find a bright red notice taped to his door citing Section 5.12 of HOA regulations prohibiting livestock or farming activities. But what really caught his attention was the handwritten note at the bottom. Those bees must produce quite a lot of honey. I wonder what that's worth these days. Patricia's rapid takeover of Oakwood Estates had been calculating and methodical. She'd arrived with a reputation that preceded her, though neighbors only discovered this later through social media groups from her previous communities. The HOA Hammer, they called her, a nickname she'd apparently embraced by having a custom gavel made for board meetings. Her LinkedIn profile, which several concerned residents uncovered, listed her occupation as community standards consultant, though no one could determine exactly what that entailed beyond making neighbors miserable. The changes under Patricia's influence happened gradually but relentlessly. First came the Mailbox Standardization Initiative, requiring everyone to purchase identical black metal mailboxes at 3 times the hardware store price from her cousin's supply company. Then the community aesthetic guidelines banned wind chimes, garden gnomes, and any lawn ornaments deemed whimsical or excessive. Children's basketball hoops were restricted to Tuesdays and Thursdays between 3 p.m. and 5 p.m. to minimize neighborhood noise pollution. Holiday decorations required pre-approval via a 17-page application that included a neighborhood visual harmony assessment. What made Patricia particularly dangerous was her knowledge of HOA legal procedures. She wielded bylaws like weapons, finding obscure clauses and reinterpreting long-standing rules. When challenged, she would smile thinly and say, "I'm just enforcing what you all agreed to when you bought here." Her particular genius lay in making reasonable-sounding arguments for unreasonable demands. The hummingbird feeders had to go because they attracted insects and created biological waste. Solar panels needed to be hidden from street view because of reflective hazards to drivers. Marcus had largely avoided Patricia's radar for the first few months. Being single, childless, and generally quiet, he hadn't violated any of her pet restrictions. He kept his grass precisely 2.75 inches high, never left his recycling bin out past collection day, and had even repainted his shutters to the approved oakwood green shade, rather than fight over the barely perceptible difference from his previous color. But that all changed on the day Patricia had been power-walking the neighborhood with her clipboard and spotted Marcus in his backyard, tending to his hives without protective gear, a skill he'd developed through years of gentle, careful handling. She'd stopped dead in her tracks, watching from behind his fence as he calmly lifted a frame teeming with bees. The look that crossed her face wasn't fear or even disgust, it was calculation. Marcus didn't see her, but his neighbor, Mrs. Abernathy, did, noting how Patricia had taken multiple photos and then smiled to herself before continuing her walk, tapping something into her phone with manicured nails. The red violation notice was just the opening salvo. Within hours of Marcus finding it, his phone began buzzing with texts from neighbors warning him that Patricia had called an emergency health and safety meeting for that evening, with his bees as the sole agenda item. The battle lines were being drawn, and Marcus, who had spent his life avoiding conflict, suddenly found himself the center of a neighborhood war he never wanted. Marcus spent the weekend gathering his documentation, county permits, the original HOA approval signed by the previous board, letters from neighbors supporting his hobby, even research papers on declining bee populations and urban conservation efforts. He presented this meticulously organized portfolio at Patricia's door early Monday morning, hoping to resolve the issue professionally. Patricia leafed through the papers with manicured nails, her expression unchanging. "Interesting," she said finally, inviting him inside. Her living room was a shrine to coordinated furniture sets and artificial flowers. Over untouched coffee and expensive cups, Patricia revealed her real agenda. "The board is under pressure to increase community amenities without raising dues," she explained with practiced concern. "Your honey could be our solution." Her proposal was breathtaking in its audacity. Marcus would donate 70% of all honey production to the HOA, which Patricia would distribute at her discretion as community appreciation gifts. In exchange, his technical violations would disappear. When Marcus politely refused, Patricia's pleasant mask slipped. "My husband's firm handles HOA litigation exclusively," she said, voice dropping to a colder register. "Daily fines add up quickly, and legal fees even faster. I hate to see you lose your house over some insects." That night, after researching Patricia online and discovering 3 previous neighborhoods where she'd left amid homeowner complaints, Marcus installed motion-activated cameras and special vibration sensors near his hives connected to his phone. The emergency meeting had gone exactly as Patricia planned. Despite several neighbors speaking in Marcus's defense, Patricia had orchestrated a parade of concerned residents, most of whom lived nowhere near Marcus, who testified about imaginary bee attacks and allergic reactions. Marcus recognized most of them as Patricia's regular lunch companions and tennis partners. The HOA treasurer, a nervous accountant named Harold, had attempted to point out that Marcus's beekeeping had been approved years earlier, only to be silenced by Patricia's withering glare and reminder that board decisions are subject to review when new information arises. The morning after Marcus refused her proposal, Patricia escalated. He opened his door to find notice of a $150 daily fine for unauthorized agricultural activity, retroactive to when Patricia had first identified the violation. The total already stood at $1,050. Patricia had also circulated a community email about dangerous insects in the neighborhood, advising parents to keep children indoors and warning about potential liability for medical emergencies. She'd gone so far as to post laminated warning signs on the community bulletin board showing grotesquely swollen bee sting reactions that Marcus recognized as brown recluse spider bites from a quick image search. Marcus was not, by nature, a confrontational person. His engineering career had taught him to solve problems methodically rather than emotionally. But as he sat at his kitchen table that evening, watching 2 neighborhood children being hurriedly pulled away by their mother when they waved at him from the sidewalk, something hardened inside him. This wasn't just about honey or even about money. It was about a bully leveraging fear to control others. He called his cousin Leon, an environmental lawyer in the next county. "I need to understand exactly what my rights are," he explained, "and then I need to know how far I can push back without crossing any lines." Leon's advice was measured but clear. Document everything, know the exact regulations backward and forward, and establish community allies. Bullies like this count on isolation, she explained. They pick off residents one by one. Your best defense is showing her she can't isolate you. The next day, Marcus took action. He set up a table at the end of his driveway with small honey samples in tiny cups, educational materials about bees, and a petition supporting local beekeeping. He invited neighbors to observe his hives from a safe distance while he explained their importance to the ecosystem. Mrs. Abernethy brought over lemonade and cookies, turning the impromptu event into something of a block party. By sunset, Marcus had collected 42 signatures, well over half the neighborhood. Patricia's response came at dawn the next morning, a formal cease and desist letter delivered by courier claiming his unauthorized food distribution violated health codes and his public gathering hadn't been approved through proper HOA channels. The letter ended with an invitation to discuss amicable resolution options at her home office that afternoon. The alert came at 5:43 a.m., time Patricia had likely chosen, believing everyone would be in deep sleep. Marcus watched in real time as she entered his yard wearing what appeared to be a hastily assembled beekeeper costume. A white bedsheet with eye holes cut out, rubber kitchen gloves duct-taped at the wrists, and her gardening hat wrapped in mosquito netting. She carried 2 large Tupperware containers and a kitchen knife, moving with the exaggerated stealth of someone who had watched too many heist movies. Marcus recorded everything as she approached the hives, muttering audibly about community property and teaching him a lesson. What Patricia didn't realize was that beehives weren't like cookie jars. You couldn't simply open them and scoop out honey. As she pried off the outer cover of the strongest hive, she broke the propolis seal with a loud crack. The colony, already stirring with the dawn and agitated by her clumsy movements, responded immediately to this invasion. The first bee found the gap where her makeshift veil met her neck. The second found the space between her glove and sleeve. By the time the 10th bee had found an opening, Patricia was performing what neighbors would later describe as an interpretive dance routine combining elements of the chicken dance and manic jumping jacks. She fled screaming across 3 yards, trailing angry bees and a bedsheet, leaping through her back door and leaving behind 1 shoe, both containers, and most of her dignity. The confrontation at Patricia's house the previous afternoon had gone precisely as Marcus expected. Her compromise had actually escalated to demanding 80% of his honey production, along with consulting fees, for her to help him properly legitimize his operation. When Marcus had calmly presented the county health department's certification of his honey as an approved cottage food product, Patricia had switched tactics, suggesting that perhaps her husband's firm could help Marcus expand his honey business through a mutually beneficial partnership. The predatory gleam in her eyes made clear what kind of partnership she envisioned, one where Marcus did all the work while she claimed most of the profit. "I'll need to think about it," Marcus had told her, watching her smile with what she thought was victory. He left her house and walked directly to 4 other HOA board members' homes, playing the recording of Patricia's thinly veiled extortion attempts. Their reactions had ranged from disgust to resignation. "She's done this before," admitted the board secretary, a retired librarian named Janet. "But no one wants to challenge her because her husband's legal connections make people nervous." That evening, Marcus had gathered a small group of neighbors at his kitchen table. Mrs. Abernethy, Janet from the board, 2 other victims of Patricia's enforcement, and retired Judge Williams from down the street. They'd strategized late into the night, developing what Judge Williams called a honey trap for the honey thief. They suspected Patricia wouldn't wait long to retaliate after Marcus's community organizing. No one expected her to act quite so boldly or foolishly. Marcus watched the security footage, torn between laughter and concern as Patricia flailed away from his property. He'd specifically positioned the cameras to cover all angles, including the perfect shot of her lifting the hive cover while clearly visible in frame. The bees, disturbed but not in pursuit beyond his yard, quickly settled back into their hive once the intruder had fled. Years of careful handling had created docile colonies that responded defensively only when directly threatened. Within minutes of Patricia's retreat, Marcus's phone began buzzing with text messages. Mrs. Abernethy, an early riser, had witnessed the entire spectacle from her kitchen window. Mr. Chen, whose security cameras had captured Patricia cutting through his yard, sent footage of her panicked flight. Most surprising was a message from Harold, HOA treasurer. "Meeting at my house, 8 a.m., bringing legal counsel. Time to end this." By noon, Patricia's husband arrived with a cease and desist letter, claiming Marcus had deliberately weaponized his bees against his wife, who was recovering from a severe allergic reaction. The letter demanded immediate removal of all hives and compensation for medical expenses. Marcus responded by sending a simple short video clip to the husband's phone. 20 minutes later, the husband returned alone, ashen-faced and suddenly accommodating. Patricia sometimes gets enthusiastic about her HOA role, he offered weakly. Meanwhile, The story had electrified the neighborhood. 3 different neighbors provided additional security footage showing Patricia's early morning prowl through their yards to reach Marcus' property. The retired judge 2 doors down offered Marcus free legal representation. Most surprisingly, other victims of Patricia's compliance campaigns came forward. The elderly couple who'd been fined for their bird feeder, the new mother threatened over drying baby clothes on a porch line, the Vietnamese family told their vegetable garden was unsuitable for front visibility. The emergency HOA meeting that evening was standing room only. When Patricia arrived wearing dark sunglasses indoors, despite the meeting occurring after sunset, and a turtleneck in 80-degree weather to hide her stings, the room fell silent before erupting in barely contained laughter. Her removal from the board was unanimously approved in what one resident called the most satisfying show of hands since my son's kindergarten graduation. The meeting at Harold's house that morning had been revelation after revelation. The HOA treasurer had been keeping meticulous records of Patricia's questionable financial decisions, the landscaping contract awarded to her brother-in-law at twice the market rate, the community improvement fund with murky accounting, the selective enforcement of fines that seemed to disappear from the books when paid by Patricia's friends. Harold, soft-spoken and conflict-averse, had nonetheless documented everything, waiting for someone brave enough to challenge Patricia's reign. "I'm an accountant," he said simply when Marcus expressed surprise at his detailed records. "Numbers don't lie, even when people do." The lawyer present, a young woman introduced only as my niece who specializes in HOA law by Judge Williams, reviewed the evidence with professional detachment that occasionally gave way to disbelief. "This is textbook abuse of power," she noted, compounded by attempted theft, trespassing, and what appears to be an ongoing pattern of extortion. She turned to Marcus. "And you have all of this documented?" By early afternoon, Patricia's attempts at damage control had shifted from offense to defense to desperation. Her husband, a corporate attorney out of his depth in the face of clear evidence and community outrage, had returned to Marcus's house with a substantially different tone. Gone were the legal threats, replaced by awkward attempts at reconciliation. "Patricia has been under a lot of stress lately," he explained, perspiration beading on his forehead despite the pleasant temperature. "Her allergist says the bee stings could have been much worse. Perhaps we could discuss a mutual non-disclosure agreement. We drop all complaints about your bees and you'd agree not to share that video." Marcus had considered this briefly before responding. "The video isn't just mine to suppress anymore. Your wife made this a community issue when she targeted not just me, but everyone who didn't conform to her vision of what this neighborhood should be." 6 months later, Oakwood Estates had transformed. The restrictive HOA bylaws had been rewritten with community input, focusing on sustainability and property values through positive initiatives rather than punitive measures. The community center now hosted a small farmers market where Marcus sold out of honey within the first hour. The garden club had installed pollinator-friendly plants throughout common areas, and 3 neighbors had installed their own beehives under Marcus's mentoring. Patricia's house stood empty with a for sale sign that had weathered through 2 price drops. Before leaving town, she had appeared at Marcus's door one final time. Her lawyer-crafted apology was clearly designed to secure the deletion of the video that had become known in neighborhood lore as the flight of the bee witch. Marcus agreed to delete his copy, recognizing that public humiliation had extracted enough of a price. As Patricia turned to leave, she paused at the step. "That honey really is exceptional," she admitted grudgingly. "I just wanted to control it." Marcus smiled and handed her a small jar labeled Second Chances. Honey from the very hive she had disturbed. "Sweetness freely given tastes better than anything taken," he told her. He never saw Patricia again, but a month later, an anonymous donation funded new equipment for the community garden's beekeeping program. Marcus kept the Second Chances batch in production, selling it with a portion of proceeds going to environmental education. Sometimes the universe delivers justice with such perfect poetry that even the most elaborate revenge couldn't improve upon it, a lesson both Marcus and Patricia had learned, albeit from very different perspectives. The transformation of Oakwood Estates didn't happen overnight. The first month after Patricia's departure had been dedicated to undoing the damage she caused. Harold led a forensic audit of HOA finances, recovering nearly $17,000 in improperly allocated funds. Janet spent weeks sorting through violation notices, canceling dozens of questionable fines. Judge Williams guided the board through rewriting bylaws to include checks and balances against future abuses of power. Spring arrived with a symbolic fresh start. The community center, previously used primarily for Patricia's disciplinary hearings, was repurposed as a hub for neighborhood engagement. The newly formed events committee organized cooking classes, book clubs, and gardening workshops. The sterile meeting room was brightened with children's artwork and community bulletin boards filled with offers of neighborly help rather than threats of enforcement. Marcus found himself in an unexpected role as something of a community leader. His beekeeping demonstrations drew crowds, and his suggestion for a community garden was enthusiastically approved. With donated land behind the community center, residents created plots where they grew vegetables, herbs, and flowers. Marcus designed a special pollinator section where his bees and those of his new beekeeping students could thrive while educating visitors about their importance. Mrs. Abernathy, now heading the education committee, organized field trips for local schools. Who would have thought my retirement would include teaching children about apiculture? She laughed, wearing a child-sized beekeeper hat a student had given her. The newly elected HOA board, including Harold as president, Janet as secretary, and Marcus as environmental liaison, established what they called the cultivation approach to community management. Rather than looking for violations to punish, they sought opportunities to support. When Mr. Rivera's fence needed repair, neighbors organized a weekend work party. When Mrs. Kim wanted to install solar panels, the board connected her with local experts and simplified the approval process. Patricia's house remained a quiet reminder of the neighborhood's previous era. The real estate agent had confided to Marcus that potential buyers kept hearing the story of the HOA hammer from neighbors during property viewings. It's like the house itself has a reputation now, she admitted.